Okay, good afternoon. We'll give it a second or so, let people log in. Okay. So as we always do, we'll start with a check of the markets. The markets are, so Jay Powell, who is the chairman of the Fed, just gave a speech about not really taking any steps anytime soon to increase interest rates. So kind of waiting until more people are employed. I think that's going to take some time to get there. So a very kind of dovish stance by the Fed. For the future of interest rates. And what that really means, like companies like tech companies who are sitting on a lot of cash, that helps them tremendously. From our standpoint, Viacom had an iffy day. I'm sitting on this stock, but I'm waiting for some big news. If it happens, it happens. And hopefully, we'll see what happens. Okay, so the last 2 days I wasn't on because we had this site's called Restream that sends out the signal to all the different platforms we're on. Wasn't working. So glad to be back now. Ray, well, from Rhode Island, so you're watching. Good to have you on. A few things for today, that emails and questions that are coming in. So I want to give you some updates. I have promised that I will update you on the lawsuit. Mark Riccio, who's an RTM member who ran for the 102nd District last year, has sued me and Atticus News, this company, claiming that our coverage of his race resulted in him having a reoccurrence of a pre-existing health condition. That's fine. It's happened. He's filed it. I have retained an attorney with Wiggin and Dana. We have every intention of fighting this. We've had residents reach out. Residents have donated. Anything you want to do is completely fine. We're just going to keep you updated. Free speech is important. We exist for that. And the idea that someone can run for office, take taxpayer money to run for office, and then not expect to be critiqued and not expect to have his actual actions public, well, he can sue. But Connecticut has some pretty strong laws about this and also has some laws about frivolous lawsuits, and we intend to make use of those legislative acts. So I will keep you updated once we file things. You can see his lawsuit online. You can go onto the judicial website and see that. Google or search for his name, and it will come up. And it's basically that claims that we did whatever, that he had a pre-existing condition come up. Okay, it's an interesting claim, and it's an interesting question about the First Amendment. And as a member of the media and someone who's been doing this for 11, 12 years now, it's going to be an interesting question. It's an odd decision by an elected official and someone who's running for office to say we didn't like our coverage and therefore we're going to sue. But we'll see what the courts do and what they think, and we'll go from there. But I think we have one of the best First Amendment attorneys we can have. Yes, it's expensive. It's the way life is. But the way Connecticut laws are written, when we win, if we win, and that's an if, the legal system is always an if, we are awarded our legal fees back. So that's a risk that we take. That's a risk that he takes. And apparently he feels it's worth taking that risk. That being said, that's where we are. I will update you probably when we file something in the next 2 weeks and let you know what's going on with that case. We will update you on this website. There'll be articles written on it. This was public to begin with. I spoke about it publicly, and the lawsuit should be public. And win or lose, I think everybody should know the outcome of a legal action like this. Okay, a few things to talk about. We have now, from both sides in Branford, our teams, or who's running for office in November. And so it's no surprise to anybody that I have already endorsed Jamie Cosgrove for a lot of reasons. I've discussed them in mass in here. Branford is a much better town now that he's the first selectman, based on what was happening before. was always a good town, but it's much better. Things are getting done. There is, even when we compare to other towns, it's doing spectacularly. I'm not a massive fan of Tom Brockett. I want to make this clear. I have no statement on his ability as a father or a husband or a person. That's him. We only speak about people's actions as elected officials. His record isn't very good. That said, and you should, if you're voting for Jamie, you should probably vote for RTM members that will support what Jamie wants to do. That said, you get to the Board of Education. And the Board of Education is an entirely different animal. And already we've seen the Democrats kind of run as a ticket. We're going to see people say the Republicans vote for them as a ticket. Don't think that way. I don't care if they're Democrat or Republican. And typically the board members have not cared either. And so the real question facing us is, what is that individual's thought process on the superintendent? Now there's discussions about extending him. There's some question on whether or not he's requested another year or not. We don't know the answer to that yet. But that's the first question that's going to come up. The second one will be chairman. There's some significant issues with John Prinz as chair. He's a nice man, but it's been fairly chaotic with him as chair. And also he gave, if you didn't see it, one of the more absurd speeches at graduation. And just at some point we'll take the video and post it for you if those who haven't seen it. But the point that I'm trying to make here is very often we see Board of Ed members run for office and say things like, we're for transparency and we're for an openness and making sure parents are part of the process. Take those lines and shove them. Take the bumper sticker politics and shove them out the window. Nobody cares. There will be specific questions we will have this year that each member on both parties should have to answer. Now, we do have a track record for some members. So Peter Burdun has been there. Tim Rayner has been there, and Christina Cantu have been there. And I would say all three of them have been people who have questioned the administration. When discussions have taken place, they have stood up and raised some issues, which are a good thing to see. So all three of them have, I would say, an advantage when it comes to running, because we do have some record of Peter Burdun is a lawyer. He's been on that board before, and he's one who does much of the questioning. Tim Rayner has asked some good questions. Christina Cantu has not only asked some good questions and challenged things, she was also instrumental years ago at getting a park redone in Hammer Field, playground equipment, things like that. So they have experience. We know those. The rest of the members either haven't been on in years or are completely new to the Branford BOE. So yes, we'll ask the incumbents. Every single member of every party running for Board of Ed will be invited on this podcast. They can come on or not. That's up to them. I have not made any endorsements in any way on the Board of Education. And we'll ask them all very similar questions. We'd like to know specifically. There's this thing that happened a few years ago where Branford's Board of Ed and many Board of Eds in the state are members of what's called CABE. And it's a group of basically retired administrators who advise boards of education. And they had a lawyer come down, and the lawyer came down and gave a presentation. The presentation was basically that Board of Ed members cannot respond to the public, and they should not answer questions publicly, and they should allow public comment, but then sit silently. There is no rules that say that. That's a lawyer saying don't talk about something, and every lawyer you've ever talked to ever has said don't talk about something. You cannot run for office as a candidate and talk about issues and then become elected and stop talking about those issues. This idea, there was this horrific idea that if a member spoke on an issue, that it might be mistaken as speaking for the board. I've never heard of that until we got to that discussion from the CABE attorney. So this idea that a Board of Ed member or a board can hide behind this ridiculous nonsense. You're elected. You get to have an opinion. You can answer questions asked to you. Now, it doesn't mean you have to. And if we have a Board of Ed meeting where there are sometimes parents who are not necessarily there for sincere reasons. They have personal gripes with the superintendent, personal gripes with other members of the board. We see that on the town side as well. Sometimes it's better off not responding. Give them their 3 minutes or 2 minutes or whatever it is and walk away. But when you have parents that maybe have never been there before and are showing up because they have a specific issue, there's nothing at all wrong with answering questions. And if you're running for office now, and at any point in the past, a parent during a meeting has asked a question and you said, I can't answer you now, you should answer for that, because that should never happen. If a parent asks a question, if there's a conversation to be had, if there's a way to answer a question quickly, do it. What happens is a parent gets up with a pretty basic question, wants an answer, no one responds, the issue festers, becomes 10 times bigger than it has to be because of CABE's nonsense advice and because members somehow forgot that they were elected. So my intention is to invite every single member who is a candidate on this podcast, and I will ask them very specific questions on where they stand on things like the superintendent asking questions at town meetings, the ability to answer, the role of the Board of Education, things of that nature. One of the things that we will have to ask as well, because it's becoming kind of a massive disaster in Guilford, is this concept of CRT, which we've talked about last week a little bit. And that is the idea of how we discuss race in school. Now, in Guilford, the Republican Party did something. So there's the move they made, and there's also the practical aspect of this. So they had 4 members who were against the CRT process. And I know CRT is basically critical race theory, this concept of, it's less about a specific concept and more about the way we look at the past and the lens by which we look at the past. I think for many of them, they have the definition wrong. They're not understanding what it actually is. 2, many of them are thinking it's being taught, and it's not really being taught. Like a teacher asking and talking to a class about history and asking if a law or a policy was race-related or had a negative impact on race, and could racism be part of the systems we have in place? I don't think that's an unfair question. And it's a good question to ask. Is that specifically CRT? No. That's a question I think the teachers have asked forever. Long before I ever heard of CRT, teachers were asking those questions. It's good to have those conversations in school. But there are some parents that were against it. It's not a small group. It's a significant group. Probably not enough to win any elections, but they kind of took over the Republican Party last week in Guilford. So Guilford got these 4 candidates, and they were actually on Fox and Friends this morning talking about this. You can go and see that for yourself if you'd like to. I would suggest that you do. That said, this might be like the final moment for them because the party didn't put up a candidate for first electment. So it's nearly impossible to not put up anybody at the top of the ticket. Where Matt Hoey is running on the Democratic side, he's fairly popular, he'll win. But what this group now did, yes, they won. They had an extra 100 people show up at the Republican primary or caucus, and they got their ticket in. But those 100 voters are not going to be enough come election time. And yes, because of minimum representation, they'll have some seats on the board, but there won't be enough to make any significant differences moving forward. What it can mean, however, is after November, Guilford's Board of Ed meetings could be a disaster. It could be primetime television. And at the end of the day, it could be very interesting to see what kind of arguments or what have you happens. I mean, people got involved because they don't like CRT. It seems a little crazy to me. Clearly it wasn't thought through, because if you're really trying to take over a majority on the Board of Ed, you have to have someone at the top of the ticket. They don't have anybody at the top of the ticket. So it's probably their last hurrah, but it doesn't mean they're not going to get some members on the Board of Ed and they can't make some noise going forward. So Guilford's an interesting town to watch. And you can see when Fox and Friends is calling you to interview you that they're trying to make this a national thing. So Guilford's got kind of a mess going on. We haven't seen this happen yet in Branford, but wouldn't be shocked if it becomes something of an issue on the Board of Ed. For my purposes and for really legal purposes, the Board of Ed and the town race really doesn't mean anything. They're not connected. There's no Jamie Cosgrove ticket when it comes to the Board of Ed. Yes, like the Republican leaders and the Democratic leaders will say vote party line. I'm not going to work that way. I've made my stance on the town side based on history and covering that. When it comes to the Board of Ed, we want to see what every individual member has to say. And CRT is one of those. Lorena, we'll talk about the Tweed Airport in a second. I have not looked in great detail about East Haven. I know your thoughts from reading, your thoughts on the current mayor in East Haven. I remember Sal Maltese running a couple years back on the Republican side. I do not have thoughts on East Haven yet. I will start paying a little more attention as we get closer. But when we get to that point, we'll get to that point. Madison, the same thing. Madison actually has a very interesting race. The current first select woman seems competent. I haven't heard any significant complaints about her. I think the party there has some issues. I've seen them do some nasty things, but I haven't heard any significant complaints about her, but I know she's running against Bruce Wilson, who's a Republican. Here's the deal about Bruce Wilson. Bruce Wilson ran for a state senate twice, and he was basically a good soldier because he ran against Ted Kennedy. Now, if you had taken the names away from that race, Bruce Wilson versus Ted Kennedy Jr., and just looked at qualifications, Bruce Wilson would have won in a landslide. Bruce Wilson's a good guy. I'm not saying he's the person. I'm not endorsing him. I'm not saying he's the person you should elect in Madison, but he ran against Kennedy, and this is an example of a name being, in an election time, sometimes it's a popularity contest, and the name matters, and people were dying to vote for. I heard people say, I can't wait to vote for the next president of the United States. Ted Kennedy's a great guy. I interviewed him at length, probably for 3 or 4 hours over 2 days. Wrote a lengthy article about him, was with him at many, many events. He's a truly genuinely nice guy. Great guy to talk to, funny, loves to eat, just a good guy. Did he really want to be in the Senate? I don't think so. That really wasn't his cup of tea. What he's doing now and advocating for those with special needs makes a lot more sense. Bruce Wilson was probably more qualified for that seat. And he ran twice. He ran good campaigns, fairly clean campaigns, but he couldn't win because you're up against a name like that. So that's going to be an interesting race in Madison, and I intend to cover that a little bit more as well. I'll get to as many races as we can, and I know the audience is kind of growing along the shoreline, so I want to cover more that helps for that purpose as well. What else today? So I did do the lawsuit. All right, Tweed. So Lorena just commented, and Lorena is clearly raising some issues, which are legitimate issues on the Tweed Airport in East Haven. But here's a broader issue. Economic development is regional. When we see a town do well, Branford do well, or Guilford do well, it's not always a product of just the first selectman or mayor in those towns. It's a product of what's happening in the larger region, in the county. And so cities, while we complain at times that cities get a lot of our tax revenue, a large part of that has to do with the fact those cities are where the jobs are. Those cities doing well, those cities being successful, helps the bedroom communities like East Haven and Branford and Guilford and North Branford, what have you, do well. It doesn't always work by itself. Now, there's things towns can do individually, but as a group, makes far more difference than an individual town. And the success of that city makes far more difference than any action any one town can take. So this idea being floated that New Haven does well with Tweed expansion, but not East Haven, or one town does better than another, simply is not a valid argument. The fact of the matter is East Haven will benefit significantly when businesses in New Haven can grow, when corporations can grow, when New Haven becomes a better destination for corporations and those jobs. That helps the entire region. Now, granted, if you live in the streets around the airport, it may not be convenient. And we can make the argument that people moved there knowing the airport was there. But in fairness, it may not be the most hospitable place to live. The airport has spent some money in the past paying for sound improvements to those homes to kind of soundproof them better. There may still be some complaints. Those are legitimate. But in general, East Haven does well if Tweed expands. If Tweed has far more towns that it can fly out of and into from. If you can connect to Florida, if you connect to Chicago, if you can connect to North Carolina, those connections help. That makes us more of a regional player when it comes to attracting businesses. Yale has asked for this for years. Corporations have asked for this for years. Because the idea that you have to fly into New York and then have a 2-hour drive to New Haven, or fly into Hartford and have an hour and a half ride to New Haven is inconvenient. And business travel often happens within the same day or within a couple days. Businesses that can now be near an airport that can connect to larger towns are more attractive to the area because we have that. So we have a lot of things in New Haven that are already attractive, right? Yale, arts. Education actually helps tremendously because you have a workforce. Having an airport expand helps everybody. And it helps not just maintain jobs, job security, higher paying jobs, but also helps property values in every town. So while you can say, yes, in the few streets around Tweed, there may be some people inconvenienced. Yes, they've moved next to an airport, but that will have tremendous positive impacts on East Haven. The idea that it's not going to impact East Haven in a positive way or potentially impact in a negative way just isn't true. They will benefit. And I have taken some time in the last 2 weeks to talk to as many East Haven residents as I can talk to, overwhelmingly supportive of Tweed. And Sean Scanlon went there. Yes, I supported Sean Scanlon going there when he first got that job. There was an article in the Current basically saying it was, he got it because who he's connected to. And my answer was, yeah, I'm glad he did get it because of who he's connected to. The ability to call Chris Murphy, the ability to call Blumenthal, the ability to call Lamont when he needed to, get connections to large-scale airport providers or large-scale companies. In this case, Goldman Sachs as an investor. That's an advantage that he had. And I think so far that has paid off. Now, this has some votes to go through. It's got a couple different things on Haven side, East Haven side it has to go through. But in general, the expansion of Tweed is a benefit to the entire region, including East Haven, certainly including Branford, but also West Haven and Hamden. And the success of New Haven itself is a success to all those surrounding towns. So I understand whether it's legitimate that we really care or we're really saying that it's going to have negative impacts on East Haven, or if it's political and it's political season or dislike of an elected official, what have you. That said, from an economic development standpoint, this is how economic development works. You expand access from other people to that town. And New Haven has done a good job without that access. But there has been a push by those corporations, by Yale, by all the biotech for years to expand that airport. And this is a huge step in the right direction for East Haven and the entire region. So I get the arguments. I get that when there's change, we want to fight it. I get that the idea of noise is scary to some people. It's not nearly as bad as we're making it sound. It's election year, we get that. But it's a good thing for the region. And East Haven will be in a better place because once that's in place and we have actually planes that can go places, there's a desire to go places, East Haven will be in a better place, as will the entire region. So I'm going to address that because I do see that being discussed online. I'm not seeing it get a lot of traction. Most of the people I've talked to in East Haven are very, very much for that expansion. And I am as well. And I think Sean so far has done a good job. Hopefully he gets it done and gets this airline in there. This airline is a small airline that's on the West Coast as well. I think it has about 8 or 9 destinations on the West Coast. I think it will be a huge advantage out here as well. I mean, not for nothing. We don't, I know there's some people in that area, but the idea that you can go from Branford 10 minutes away and take a flight to Charlotte or Chicago or Florida is huge. It's massive. And we don't have to go to New York. We don't have to go to Bradley to be in and out. And if you're coming in for a work trip and you're meeting Yale, you can get off a plane, half hour later, be in your meeting, and 2 hours later, be back on a plane going back. That's a huge advantage from an economic development standpoint. So I think Tweed growing is significant. I think it can help a lot. And that's a good thing. The one thing I failed to mention that I have here on my notes, we have talked a lot of times about this extra $300 that's coming on unemployment. And the state has taken a step now that mandates that those that are getting unemployment also now show that they're looking for work. And that's on the surface, that's a very good thing. We had a situation in Branford where, because they couldn't get workers in the kitchen, there may have been some other issues there, but large restaurants like Donovan's Reef closed, had to close temporarily. Many restaurants were getting complaints and reviews online for restaurants because they don't have staff and the service is terrible, or they can't get stuff out of the kitchen fast enough. Restaurants cannot find workers. And I'll tell you what they're dealing with now. As people on unemployment are now required to give about 3 job applications they filed each week to get their extra $300 or to get unemployment benefits in general, businesses are getting a lot of phone calls with applicants, which is good. Then they never show up for the appointment because all they're trying to do is make sure they have 3 applicants that applications they can show to make sure they get that unemployment. We live with this fundamental belief that people want to work. And this is making me question that. I think there are career people who want to work. If you're a lawyer or a doctor or a nurse, or if you've invested in education for a career, electrician, plumber, what have you, not necessarily college, but in a union, what have you, I think you want to work. But there are a large number of people who jobs are just jobs. They're not part of life. They're just a thing that you have to do. And if there's a reason not to do them, they'll do them. And I think this is where Democrats may have to rethink some of their thinking. The idea that, people want to work and therefore will look for reasons to work may not always be true. People have no problem calling up and sending applications into a place to work and then never showing up with no intention of actually looking for that job. And some of these jobs are well-paying jobs. $17, $18, $19 an hour, far more than they were ever making pre-COVID, because these places are desperate and now they get games played where they're paying sites like Indeed for applications. They get 30, 40 applications and nobody shows up for an interview. Or they show up for an interview and they're nowhere remotely close to qualified for a job. The idea that people inherently want to work isn't always true. And when we're coming up with legislation, that overwhelming premise that, people just aren't paid enough or they're not, enough to get by. No, that's not the case. They don't want to work. Especially those making the lower end of the spectrum. They don't want to work. People who have invested in education, they want to work. They want to go back. But so this is a significant switch that has to happen. This is a really good case study that the economy is roaring right now. There is no place not hiring. You can have the pick of any job you want right now. And you could probably name your price. Jobs that were $13, $14 an hour or $17, $18 an hour right now. I know delis that after tips, you're going to make $20, $21 an hour. They're throwing money and they're throwing signing bonuses at people to work in kitchens. There is no excuse for people not to be working right now, unless you realize that there are people who don't want to be working. And that's something we have to remember when we pass laws that say we just need people to make more money. They're struggling to get ahead. No, they're sitting home. Some are struggling, yes, but many are sitting home. And that's the reality. And we have to change the way we think about our workforce when we're passing laws that hand out money to people as an incentive to not work. That's a problem. Okay, we'll wrap it up for today. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm sorry for the last couple of days off. It looks like our streaming software is working well. If there are questions, if there are comments, please send them in. We'll talk more. Just some of the comments. I'm sorry I didn't see these. Brett Jolie is a candidate for Board of Ed. He's commented, thank you much for the excellent insights about the Branford board. You're welcome, Brett. Look forward to meeting you. We'll have you on in the near future, or you'll be invited on in the near future. Whether you come on is up to you. Richard, I see restaurants here that is doing takeout only due to the lack of help. All I see is signs on businesses saying every business is hiring. I've seen businesses throwing a ton of money. First of all, if you're on unemployment now and not working, it's stupid. Now's the time that you can get any job you want. In 4 or 5 months, that job at $19 an hour now might be back down to $14 or $15 an hour because more people will be looking for work. So if you are on unemployment now, find the right job in the next 2 weeks and take it. Get off unemployment. You're going to make more money working than you will at any point in the future. So get that job. If you're hired at $19 an hour, it's hard to reduce your pay later. So you're stupid if you're staying home for an extra $300. I get it. It's nice out. It's a beach day. I understand that. But there's so much opportunity out there. And our legislators have to start understanding that there are groups of people that will look for reasons not to work. The fundamental belief that we have, and that I had, that people want to work, they're looking for ways to work, isn't always true. And that has to be remembered when we're passing legislation, especially when it comes to how much money we're handing out to people. The doors are open. There's plenty of work. People don't want it. They're staying home. They're enjoying the beach. Okay, I'll be back tomorrow at 4 o'clock. As always, if there's questions, comments, send them in, and we will answer those as we can. Until then, I hope you guys have a great night. I'll see you tomorrow.